Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LPL Summer Split Playoffs Round 2 overview and analysis video. Very excited to get into this. Just a couple of hours ago, I got done with the final cast here for round number 2, and we immediately go into round 3 later on tonight, so I want to make sure I can get this video out at least at a decent time. I wanted to get some rest in between, considering the time zone for these LPL casts, but definitely going to be rushing this one out, so I hope you guys are excited. I had to watch all of these in a very short amount of time. I definitely got a lot of notes on them though, so definitely not going to feel overly rushed. First and foremost, as a reminder, if you want to see my live cast for one of the series here, the final one, AL versus Ninjas in Pyjamas, you can check out the link in the description for LPL English. I was on the cast alongside Yanni, and I think we did a pretty darn good job of going over the games there, but we'll be going over everything else here today. And I have been kind of saying this at the start of videos for all of the regions. There is a new YouTube feature called Hype, which I think utilizes points that you guys give to creators around my size. I believe it's 500 subscribers to 50,000 subscribers, certainly fall within that range at the moment, and it can kind of help boost some of the videos in the algorithm. I'm not really sure, like, 100% how it works or how important it is, but if you guys enjoy the videos, I know, there are a lot of people who watch only one of these regions kind of weekly, so I've been trying to say it in each region respectively. If you guys really enjoy the videos, it would mean a lot to me if you use some of those hype points that you've generated on my videos. I believe it actually works more for channels around my size if I'm sitting at like 2,500 subscribers, as opposed to if you used it on somebody that had like 20,000 subscribers. So just one of those things where if you want to use it on me, great. If you don't, that's also completely fine. Thank you again for watching either way, but let's get into the content itself in this video. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the video, we will be looking at the updated bracket. Our first two teams will be eliminated from the playoffs by the end of this video. As a reminder, the LPL basically the only region with an actual regional qualifier at this point, and so depending on who ends up losing in the lower bracket here today, their year could either be over, or alternatively, they could, have to hope for enough championship points to get into the regional qualifiers. We'll talk about the ins and outs of that when we get to the lower bracket, but we've got the upper bracket round 2 to cover as well. Getting into that top 3 and that winners finals is massive, so I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. With all that being said, let's get into the analysis. Let's jump into our upper bracket round 2 matchups. As a reminder, they are playing, at least in the upper bracket, for winners finals already. The winners of these two series will guarantee themselves top 3 here in the summer split. And for, these 4 teams that are staring down the barrel of getting there, that could be enough to get them at the very least into a high position in the regional qualifier. At best, like championship points wise, top 3 might get you that second seed going to Worlds without the need of a regional qualifier. So a lot on the line for every single team in the upper bracket, and we kicked it off with the closer seeded matchup here between the number 2 seeded Invictus Gaming and the number 3 seeded Bilibili Gaming. And BLG is going to pick up the 3-1 series win, kind of against expectations, against the grain in a series like this. I think everybody had kind of been looking at Top Esports and Invictus as the 2 most consistent and best teams in the LPL, but as anybody who's ever followed this league knows, the moment that those 2 orgs in particular, Top Esports and then, Rookie and the Shy, the moment they are looked at as favorites, that's when everything starts to turn itself over. There is no consistency. You cannot feel comfortable with any upper team in the LPL, and that definitely applied to Invictus in this series. For BLG, though, on the winning side, they were tremendous in this series. I honestly don't think there's a lot to criticize. They were just better than Invictus in almost every way. I think it's really notable that Beishwan actually played the entire series here in the jungle. No Shadow at all, and no Shadow was necessary. Beishwan came in at the beginning of the, really the midway point of the year to replace Wei, and they really wanted to stick that point home because there was a pretty big jungle gap in this series. But we'll go ahead and talk about it here. Player of the series for me is very obviously going to Knight in the mid lane. This guy is just ridiculously good. He's the best player in the LPL. I voted for him for MVP, as you guys know, on this channel. I just think he's been absolutely dominant for BLG, and he's doing it on champions that you wouldn't necessarily consider, hyper carries. He's dominating on Galio. He's dominating on Lissandra in game number 4 to set up for things like Kiana and Nefiri coming out of Beishwan in the jungle. That's the kind of flexibility that Knight offers your team that not every mid laner in the world is going to have the flexibility to have. Rookie is a very good player, and he was my second team all-pro mid laner. I do believe he is playing better than, a lot of people are even giving him credit for right now. Certainly better than any other point this year, but but the problem with someone like Rookie is that he is so much better on these facilitators. He is so much better when he gets to play front to back in team fights, and Knight just doesn't have that problem. You're not really locked into a play style with him as a player. He's just good at everything, and it's unfair. Like, I know I've gone on many rants over and over again on this channel throughout many years talking about how Knight is undervalued by the community, but I think somehow, some way we've landed there once again. This is not only the best player in the LPL, really without any sort of question, in my opinion. I think he's making a case to be the greatest LPL player of all time. I certainly think he's got to, at the very least, be near the top of that conversation, and it's performances like this that just make it so ridiculously obvious, where he mega gaps Rookie in lane. He's able to generate gigantic leads for himself. He utilizes that on these macro champions to move around and make Beichuan's life a lot easier, to make Elk's life a lot easier in the later part of the game. It just opens up everything for BLG, and what that means for the team as a whole is now, obviously, they've won this series, and we'll get into this a bit more as we talk, later on in this series, but moving on to winners finals, like, you cannot count this team out. Like, this team absolutely can win the LPL. I think a lot of people have written off BLG as being, an LPL championship caliber team, a team that can go to Worlds as the #1 seed because of what they showed at MSI, because of how inconsistent they were in the regular season. But if you have Knight, anything is possible. Truly, they can win on any given day. Talking about the rest of the team, Beichuan is also a player that I think you have to shout out. I know his KDA isn't exactly, incredible here, but there was a very big jungle gap in terms of the amount of pressure and tempo that was generated here for BLG, specifically on, like I said, the Kiana and the Nefiri. It really does feel like BLG indexed very heavily into making sure that he was kind of the main character of this series, and that's not how Beichuan has ever really been treated on any team he's ever been on, and I think he did a great job with it. Really, the only game they faltered was game number 3, but, I mean, that's basically the dream IG comp. It's Sion, Skarner, Azir on the top side, even something like Jhin for Gala. Really just fits his playstyle, but Beichuan, I think, was excellent and certainly better than Wei, kind of proving that him coming in and replacing him as the starting BLG jungler this year was the right decision. We'll see how much they want to give him, some runway here. I think this 6-man roster is super beneficial to BLG in the state that they're currently in with Beichuan and with Shadow. I think both of them are very good, but if Beichuan is going to step in and have more domestic success, because quite frankly, he just has over the course of this year, then, that's certainly a direction that they're going to have to look at, and he's now gotten them to winners finals alongside his star mid laner. Bin and Elk were excellent as damage carries. I think On was really good as a facilitator. Really everybody on BLG stepping up here today, but jungle mid, the middle of the map, the important part here for BLG being the ones to push them forward. And for Invictus on the other side, it's kind of the opposite story, right? Like, you can look at the Shy having a really rough series and not really having any impact on games, and I think that's fair. You can look at Gala playing game 4 quite poorly, probably his weakest game of the entire series on the Zeri. Mako couldn't really salvage that. It's fine. He was really good in game number 3, kind of carried them across the finish line in that one. The mid-jungle duo just wasn't good enough. Like, Wei and Rookie got completely outplayed, and they've been the ones that have really elevated the consistency, in my opinion, of what IG have to offer. Wei, for me, is going to get done of the series in the jungle. It really just felt like he was almost completely outplayed at every possible avenue in this series. I know a lot of people are going to look at Rookie and see some problems there. I think part of that is just game 4 bias, right? Like, the Ahri game was the worst game that Rookie played in this series. Not that he was great on the Rise or the Annie at the beginning, but certainly the Ahri game was worse. But I think Wei truly was outplayed at almost every avenue throughout this entire series. I don't think he had a single play that ended up being really positive outside of that game 3 on the Skarner. It really just felt like he was behind the 8 ball, and that's really to the credit of Beichuan. I think individually as a player, you're looking at somebody who, was kind of talked about last year like somebody that not only didn't deserve to be in the LPL, but like people were laughing at the fact that this guy had a roster spot. I know it's a weird comparison to make, but look at the way everyone looks at Aki right now. That's how people were looking at Beichuan last year. Now he's coming in and gapping someone like Wei after taking his job. It's just a ridiculous turnaround, and Wei really had no answer to that. The Vi was not good in game 4, but again, specifically the Trundle and the Wukong were really bad in games 1 and 2, and I think that really ended up kind of putting them behind. The Wukong had no tempo, and if you're going to play Wukong Annie and you're going to lose the mid jungle, like, the game is over. There's no way to be able to play that out. They're so centralizing as a draft that if you end up falling behind on that duo, it's kind of cooked. Like, there's just not really a ton you can do in that instance. So Wei really underperforming. Again, Rookie was not very good. There was a pretty large mid gap in this series, but I think so much of that was in game 4, where Knight was truly exceptional in, on the Lissandra, moving around the map, creating things alongside the Nefiri, and Rookie was just very useless on the Ahri. I think Rookie was bad, but not worse than Wei throughout games 1 and 2, and so I don't lean for him for dead of the series, but I do want to say Knight was incredible, and Rookie had no answer. There is a #1 mid laner in the LPL, and everybody else is not on that same level. Rookie, second team All-Pro, very much deserved and earned that grade. If he's the second best mid laner, there are at least 2 tiers in between Knight and everybody else in the mid lane role right now. The Shy's KDA is pretty indicative. Bin was really good and the Shy was not in this series. Gala and Mako were excellent in game number 3. That Jhin Rakan combo was absolutely devastating, but they also kind of let their team down in game 4. Gala ended up playing that Zeri game pretty poorly in terms of his positioning, but he also had to 1v9 throughout a lot of the rest of this series, and so I'm not going to put it too much on him. And Mako's obviously been fine. He just had to play things like Bard and Lulu throughout a lot of this series while the rest of his team was running it down in the middle of the map. IG had so many expectations going into a series like this, but with those expectations, like, that's how you know IG, are in a spot where potentially things could go awry. This team has never been able to live up to expectations, either for good or for bad. Sometimes they're counted out and they overperform, and sometimes they're expected to do really well and they just can't quite live up to it. They go down to the lower bracket now. It does not get easier from here because they're actually on the bad side of the lower bracket. They could potentially run into a team like Anyone's Legend in round number 2. Things are definitely heating up for the top 4, and it's all because of this loss. But it's a huge win for BLG to get themselves into winners finals. It's one step closer to making the World Championships, and really at the end of the day, that's the goal. Winning the LPL is still the goal for this team, and you have the best player in the entire region to do it in Knight. He really is that good, and once again, he is pushing this team into being contenders basically off the back of his play. Then moving on to our second upper bracket series and our second team to qualify for winners finals here, as we got a pretty predictable matchup, quite frankly, between the #1 seeded Top Esports and the #5 seeded Weibo Gaming, where Top Esports are going to be able to pick up the 3-1 series win, once again going to 4 games, dropping a random game in the series as TES is known to do, but, pretty convincingly being able to pick up the win. I think they were the better team here today, although Weibo put up more of a fight than Invictus did against Bilibili. I certainly will say that, whereas the IG BLG series was, Knight and Beichuan playing really well and really having jungle mid priority the entire series. Top Esports had some up and down moments. Like, they were the better team. They ended up executing better in the big moments, but game 3 was probably the most dominant game of the entire series for Weibo, and that's a good sign, like, that they're able, when they win really hard. And even the other games, they were a bit more back and forth. It just really came down to better execution from TES when it mattered the most. And I think specifically on the games where Kanavi could go in and really set up a lot for the rest of the team, he's going to get player of the series for me. I continue to die on the hill that right now, at least in the LPL, there is no better jungler than Kanavi in terms of the way he is playing the game. I think he does everything at such a high level. He's so good at accumulating resources in the early game. He still is the best early game jungler in the world. You can talk about how he's not perfect in other areas of the game. He's going to make mistakes. He's going to have a couple of really bad skirmishes. He's going to, not team fight perfectly every single time. There are flaws to Kanavi's game. I'm not trying to pretend like he's the best jungler in the world, but certainly at the aspect of like pre-7-minute pathing, like there is nobody who is so consistent at getting leads like Kanavi, even in the LCK. Right now, in terms of the way that he plays the game, Jarvan, Pantheon, these kinds of champions that just allow him to play so fast and so reckless, really let him scale the game out of control very quickly. And I think we saw that in games 2 and 4, where he was really important both early and late. I think opening up the map with the Pantheon, even if it was paired with Cream's Victor, which, not a big fan. Cream playing a lot of these, late game scaling, more passive oriented mid laners. It's just not really his style. Not that I think he's terrible, in general at it. I think if he went up against weaker teams, perhaps you could, see some bigger pop-off moments, but things like Victor, they just don't necessarily play into the strengths of Top Esports, especially paired alongside something like the Pantheon in the jungle. Not really a big fan of that, but Kanavi makes it work out anyways because his game is just so solid. He's able to do so much damage basically in every exchange that ends up getting taken throughout the game that it really does not matter. The only thing you can say is that you look at the KDA at the end of this series, you see 16, 18, and 38. Usually having more deaths than kills in a series like this is not ideal if you are a jungler, but almost all of those deaths, in fact, almost half of them came from game number 3. I think he was 0 and 8 on the Neferi. It is what it is, right? Like, sometimes you have a bad game every once in a while. TN just completely runs things light, gets mega fed on the Kalista, and just ends up winning the game. Outside of that, Kanavi was great, I think, especially in games 2 and 4, like I said, but the Kiana was still fine in game number 1, certainly was good enough for them to be able to win with. As for other positives, I think 369 is going a bit undervalued for how important he was towards the team in this series. I think he was actually really relevant in the way that he played side lanes and the way that he stepped up to kind of supplement and be that secondary damage dealer is the way that I like to put it in this series. Breathe was totally fine on the other side, had a couple of really nice games, but that doesn't take away what what 369 was capable of doing in this series. I think he's starting to get a bit more consistent. He was really big in their first round matchup against NIP. Once again, definitely stepping up here against Weibo Gaming. Jackie Love had a couple of big moments. I think specifically down the stretch of this series, he was better. Really outside of game number 3, Jackie Love was awesome throughout this series. Same thing for Hong. Basically all of their deaths and their KDAs kind of getting a little bit deflated here all come from game number 3. But the Zeri was massive in game 4. Massive AD carry gap in that 4th and final game. I considered giving Light dud of the series. We will talk about that in just a moment, but couldn't quite justify it with how well he played at the beginning here, and especially in game 3 on the Callista. But Jackie Love was certainly better as an AD carry throughout the entirety of this series and really propelled his team upwards. Hong was fine. You know, I don't think this was like a ridiculous performance. These two supports going up against their former teams from earlier this year. They both had a lot to prove. I don't think either of them necessarily proved all that much, but, you know, really the only conversation surrounding the bot lane is that, you know, we'll talk about Light and Crisp on the other side because they were really relevant both towards the good and the bad of Weibo Gaming. Kareem's scoreline looks good. He's just not comfortable on champions like Victor. You know, I love him on Assassins. He is really good in that role. I get that other teams are going to be a bit more prepared for it, but seriously, like, I really do think just getting Kanavi on something like Pantheon and getting Kareem on something like Akali, like, we should just be going for that in these games. It doesn't have to be Victor. It doesn't have to be, you know, Galio in game number 3. I don't think he's terrible on these champions in the same way that, you know, a lot of other people seem to. I think that there are some positives, especially to something like Azir, for the way that Kareem plays, even if he hasn't been so good at it lately, but it doesn't feel comfortable. It never feels like TES at their best when they force Kareem to be on these kinds of champions. And, you know, I get it, like, you want to be critical of a player that's a little bit more limited or one-dimensional in terms of a play style. That's fair, but it's up to the team to get the most out of their players, regardless of whether or not it fits the identity of what they want. And I think Kanavi is more than fine playing a lot of these skirmishers to play alongside these assassins. So for Top Esports, there are some things I think they need to clean up, but for the most part, still a very good series. And then for Weibo on the other side, dud of the series for me is going to go to Crisp in the support position. Kind of hard to pick a dud of the series here because while I think that there were a lot of okay games from Weibo, there weren't a lot of like terrible performances. I think the Vayne ended up really being a problem in game number 4. If you're going to play Morgana Vayne as your mid AD carry, your carry duo in this one, get that more facilitative mid laner that, you know, the support mid that has kind of come back into the meta. We're going to talk about another one later on in this video, but, you know, Morgana making a lot of appearances in round number 1 of the playoffs alongside, you know, more of these hyper carry types of AD carries. If you're going to do that, you need to make sure your AD carry is on board to actually try and generate resources early, and you need to overload that side of the map, but they just didn't. This Vayne existed. The Morgana lost mid lane, didn't really have pressure as you would expect, and then Weibo was kind of neutral in the bot lane going into the late game, and Jackie Love had way more pressure because you actually had a real mid laner on the other side for Top Esports. Again, if you're going to do this, you need to make sure this Vayne is as strong as possible, and it was just a lack of aggressive moves coming in from Weibo that I think really ended up setting them behind. Outside of that, I think, you know, I considered Light for dud of the series because of the Vayne game. Just couldn't really do it. The Callista was really good in this series, and I think even the Kai'Sa, the Yunara, they were generally fine. I just landed on Crisp because I think you did need to do more in terms of how that game was played. The Leona was quite bad in game 4, and I think specifically you're looking at the Braum and the Nico as well in games 1 and 2 where he was pretty inconsistent. TN, I think, also got out jungled, especially in terms of tempo. If you're going to play 4 skirmishers, essentially, like Wukong, definitely more of a team fight threat, but the Xin Zhao, the Vi, the Trundle, if you're going to play a lot of these champions, you have to be active in the early game, and I think Kanavi was simply just better in that role. I like TN, but Kanavi is the best jungler in the league right now, and I think he got set back a bit here. Xiaohu and Breathe were fine, generally speaking. I'm not too mad at Xiaohu because he played Morgana and couldn't really do anything in game 4, but also this guy keeps pulling Morgana out in the playoffs, and it is not working for this team, and so we'll see if they end up making that adjustment. Breathe, like I said earlier, was pretty solid, especially in their one win in game number 3, but he was solid throughout the entire series. Just 369 was also good, and top lane didn't really matter all that much towards the series as a whole. So for Weibo, kind of the expected result, but you looked okay in this series. Going down to the lower bracket, perhaps there is still some Weibo magic within them to get them a shocking world's berth, but for Top Esports, they move on to winners finals. They are one series away from getting back to the LPL finals after, you know, basically bottoming out in the spring split. They're already better than what they were last split, like guaranteed. They're guaranteed top 3 no matter what, which is really nice for this team. I think right now you have to consider them the best in the LPL. We'll see if that can land true going into winners finals, but there is so much about this team to like, and even if their consistency isn't necessarily the highest, even if they are a bit more one-dimensional than some of the best teams we've seen before, there still is a lot of talent on this team, and they can blow by anybody on any given day. But now that we've covered our 2 upper bracket series, it's time to move down to the lower bracket, and the stakes might be even higher for these series, as depending on who ends up winning and who ends up losing, we could be seeing our first eliminations of the year from the playoffs here, depending again on championship points. But our first series that we got was a matchup between the number 6 seeded JD Gaming and the number 10 seeded Edward Gaming, and JDG are just barely going to pick up the 3-2 series win. It's going to go the distance all 5 games between these two teams, and JDG, luckily for them, is going to be able to come out on top. If EDG had won this, they would have kept their hopes alive moving on to the next round, potentially taking on a team like Weibo, and at least having a shot to get themselves further along into the playoffs. But JDG shut the door on that. They shut the door on EDG, and they officially eliminate them for the year. They do not have enough championship points with this elimination from the playoffs to get into the regional qualifiers. So, unfortunately for Edward Gaming, the Miracle Nirvana run is just not going to happen. But it's a nice win for JDG. Some ups and some downs throughout this series. Certainly some good and some bad games to talk about. But let's talk about the good first and foremost. Player of the series is very obviously going to Pyjamas in the bot lane. This guy was ridiculously good in this series, and I truly don't know where this team would be right now if Pyjamas was not on JDG, because as much as we talk about players like Shun having a couple of good moments, Xiaoshu, I think, has stepped up over the course of the summer split. He's been an upgrade in the top lane to what Ala was for this team. Pyjamas is the one player that genuinely has world-class mechanical upside and can carry games at a ridiculous level, and you look at the way that he played this series, okay, they lose when he's on Misfortune, they win when he's on Zeri, and even Caitlyn, like something that can really, isolate the game entirely around it. It just ends up being really positive for him. He was excellent on the Lucian as well in game number 2. I would say the Lucian and the Zeri games were his 2 best games, but it just goes back to what I've been saying about Pyjamas for a very long time on Gen G over in the LCK. This guy is the best Zeri in the world. There is no conversation, in my opinion. You can talk about some really good Zeri players. This guy plays this champion at a ridiculous level, and the fact that he was allowed to get Zeri alongside Lulu, alongside Skarner in the jungle for all of this setup, even something like a Victor for Scout that really plays into his own individual playstyle, just feels kind of ridiculous for EDG. You can't really be giving that over in a do-or-die game number 5. It's full comfort for some of the best players in the world, and that's just really not ideal. But again, Pyjamas, if JDG didn't have him, this team would be in a nightmare situation right now. Luckily for them, they do have a world-class AD carry, and even if he's not looked like it all year long, especially in the summer split where things have gotten at least a bit worse for him, I think the reintroduction, or I guess the introduction of Zhuo to this team has somehow made Pyjamas a little bit better. Not trying to say that Wink was, a worse player than Zhuo. I don't believe that. I think Wink is still a better player than Zhuo, but it's quite clear that whatever Zhuo's doing in the support position, and you can see it, he's playing Karma and Lulu, him coming in and doing that and just playing entirely for his AD carry, that's made this team better. And as much as I don't think Zhuo is a top tier player, if he's just going to stay out of the way and allow his AD carry to run things, he can be valuable for the team, and I think he was valuable in this series. Palkia tried some really aggressive plays. We'll talk about him once we get to EDG, but I think Zhuo was certainly more consistent in this series, which is all you really need out of him. The other player that I really want to shout out is Scout in this series. Some pluses and minuses, again, specifically for him. He has rightfully, I think, received the reputation over the course of this year of being not good, of having the worst year of his entire career. I'm not going to say it's entirely similar to how we talked about Xiaohu in summer of last year, but at least Xiaohu kind of responded in the playoffs, ended up really stepping up when that team needed him to, even if he was terrible throughout all of the regular season, and got his team to Worlds, got his team to the semifinals of Worlds, alongside Tarzan. But Scout is just not, playing at a ridiculous level. I think he needs that one particular playstyle. Again, luckily for JDG, that EDG basically gave it to them on a platter in game number 5. They gave Scout Victor, probably a champion that fits his playstyle most of anything in the entire meta right now, and Pyjamas got Zeri as well to be able to play off of that late game carry duo. Scout looked very good in that role, but outside of that, do you have questions about the Aurora and the Akali? Absolutely. This guy's just not very good at these aggressive picks right now. There's a lot going wrong in terms of the way that he's playing the mid games on those champions in particular, but if you can get him on comfort, he can still be very effective there. Shun was solid enough, I would say. He's certainly not been nearly as good as he was at the beginning of the year. He was really pushing this team forward. This guy was white hot in split number 1 in the winter split. People forget this team was in winners finals for a reason. They were a top 3 team in winter. They looked like they were going to be top 3 throughout basically all of the regular season in spring, and then Shun just couldn't keep that form going. If he can get back online, that's massive. Xiaohao was still very good on the other side of this matchup, as he always is. I'm the biggest Xiaohao glazer in the world, but Shun was certainly good enough. Xiaoxu certainly had some moments in this series where you can question Mark Pingham a bit more. You can even say similar things about Scout, about Zhuo. There were moments, especially in their losses. That game 3 was nightmarish from JDG, but for the most part, they had enough firepower to be able to get over their own problems, and Pays was exceptional here today, and the AD carry gap in particular was just too large for EDG to be able to overcome. And then that kind of transitions nicely into talking about Edward Gaming. Unfortunately, this is the last time we will see this org and these players in 2025. I would consider this a successful year and a successful split, though. Maybe they wanted to try and compete, a little bit north of where they're at right now. But honestly, like top 8, I think is fine for EDG in terms of the way that this roster is constructed. There are players on this team that I really like that I think looked excellent. Xiaohao is a player that I've gone to bat for over and over and over again every single year on this channel. I still believe that if you get him on a team with someone like Doingbi going into 2026, you could potentially be looking at an even better year for him than what he had here in 2025. I still believe there is a breakout to be had for Xiaohao, but it just wasn't going to happen this year. The talent around him was good, but not great. He was exceptionally good in the regular season, as he always is, but he was going up against weaker talent, and while he was good in this series and certainly was good in the playoffs, it wasn't good enough for him to be able to elevate this team beyond top 8. I also think Angel showed that he is the player that he kind of has been over the past couple of years, where you kind of have to consider him like a top like 6 or 7 mid laner in the league. Like, I think that is a fair way to put it. He's an upper half mid laner in the LPL. And I think there are a lot of teams that would really benefit from having a player like that. He's not going to be a primary carry option. You would prefer him to play a secondary carry role, but he can really generate resources for himself. His laning was exceptionally good throughout this entire year, and if he's going to be able to keep that up, these are 2 players that I definitely want to see moving forward. And of course, the other player is Palkia down in the support position. They really found something here with EDG. Now, I will say, some of those aggressive tendencies definitely need to be weeded out. Like, I think it's fair to say that he's certainly not a complete project just yet. There are a lot of things that need to be fixed up in the mid game, and he really is terrible from behind, and I get that that's kind of the support position in general, but he makes some terrible plays when they are down in resources to try and desperately pull the game back. I think the problem is he just goes into desperation but a little bit too quickly for me and ends up kind of pushing games out of control. But man, the mechanics are there, the engage instincts are there. He's really aggressive. He's not scared to make plays. I think Palkia could be a real difference maker here. ZDZ was also fine this year, generally speaking. Wasn't very good in this series, even if Xiaoxu wasn't also like ridiculous on the top side. ZDZ had his own set of mistakes, but we'll see if he ends up playing next year. And then unfortunately, dud of the series for me is pretty obvious to talk about. It's going to go to On in the AD carry role. Just as Pays was exceptionally good in this series, On was the player holding this team back throughout basically all of the summer split. And that's so frustrating. I think that's got to be frustrating for anybody who's watched this guy over the past 2 years, because 2023 and 2024 were both excellent years for On individually as a player. We were really looking at this guy as somebody that, especially after last year, could break through as like a top 6, top 7-ish AD carry in the league. And I think, could play up to the level that someone like Angel or Xiaohao had been playing to throughout a majority of this year, and it just did not happen. It all kind of came crashing down in 2025. Obviously, kind of a rough start to the year, ends up getting replaced at the beginning of the year, basically for no reason, ends up getting reinserted into the starting lineup here for EDG, and never really finds his footing. It really is, kind of a frustrating turn of events, but this Senna was nightmarish. I mean, just stepping up and dying for no reason, being out of position. And it wasn't just the Senna game, it was the Jhin game as well in game number 4 that I think really ended up being negative for the team as a whole. But On just had to be better. Like, again, with this jungle mid playing well, I think ZDZ was solid enough. Palkia is so aggressive. If you had an AD carry that could step up and perform at the same level of the rest of this team, you probably win this series. Genuinely, that might be the big difference maker, and I hate to put so much of it on one player, but just ended up not working out. I'm interested to see what happens with On going forward, but this was a player that we were worried about before the big breakout that happened a couple of years ago, and now, he's kind of back to that version. Hopefully that's not reality. Hopefully he can figure things out going into 2026, but in general, I think this was one of those good but not great teams that you just kind of want to cheer for in the LPL. EDG was the Hall of Very Good in this year in terms of the players that they have. Xiaohao, Angel, Palkia, like ZDZ, these are all players that are somewhere around the 7th or 8th best players in their role. Maybe not so much ZDZ. No flame to him, just that not quite on the same level as Xiaohao, Angel, maybe even Palkia at this point. But this result in general kind of encapsulates that. This was a team that was good enough to make playoffs even out of Group Nirvana. They were able to take down some Group Ascend teams, and they were able to go the distance, 5 against the top 6 team in JD Gaming. They just couldn't quite close it out. But for JDG, they move on now to the second round. They play Weibo Gaming in that next round, a matchup that they are quite familiar with. A lot of players that have played against each other a ton in that matchup, and obviously they had multiple series against each other at the end of the regular regular season as well. So they'll need to step up for that, because if they play the way they did here today against a much weaker EDG team, JDG might be the negative team that all of the haters kind of say they are right now. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the video, and it's one I got to cast live, luckily enough. So, as per usual, I will go ahead and give my general thoughts, and then you can check out the VOD if you want my full thoughts and opinions on this series. But it was a matchup between the number 4 seeded Anyone's Legend and the number 9 seeded Ninjas in Pyjamas. And Anyone's Legend are going to be able to pick up the 3-1 series win, but do not get it twisted. This was not a 3-1 dominant win like it might look on the surface. 27-minute win in Game 2, 30-minute win in Game 3. These look okay. It looks like, AL was in a good spot. AL lost early game 3 straight games. They were down in gold heavily in games 2 and 3 and just were able to outplay NIP at the end. I think game 3 was definitely a bit more dominant. Game 2, though, definitely not the sub 28-minute win that it looks like on paper right now for AL. It really did feel like NIP was going to go up 2-0 and then 2-1 in this series, and they just couldn't quite hang on. A couple of nerves coming in for some key players for Ninjas in Pyjamas that really ended up costing them. And just a general lack of execution that ends up being really kind of the nail in the coffin for NIP, and this will end their year, again, very similar to the story with EDG, because they're from Group Nirvana, because they haven't had the success throughout the beginning of this year. They've not generated enough championship points to get eliminated here and still get into top 6, and so their 2025 is done, and I know there's a lot of conversation surrounding whether or not this might be the last time we see someone like Doingbi play pro. I'm not sure one way or another which direction that is going to head, but Doingbi was really good throughout a majority of this year. I really hope it's not the final time we see him. But for AL, the actual victors of this series, while there is some good to talk about, there is still a lot of bad to talk about in this series as well. So let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the series, the one player that you can look at and genuinely just see a consistent series in was Tarzan in the jungle, who, like I said, is getting player of the series. He really dominated a majority of these games. His early games were nightmarish, like for Nio. I should say, not for his team, for the enemy team. Game 1, he puts Nio down 30 CS on this Kiana, basically makes it unplayable, somehow loses that game. Game 2, he does something similar. The Pantheon is already set behind pretty heavily in Game 2, and yet Nio does a great job recovering to try and make things happen. Tarzan still deserves a lot of credit for that, and once again, he did it in Game 4 on the Xin Zhao. It's just over and over again, really taking the game over by taking advantage of the nerves and the mistakes that the young jungler on the other side of this matchup was making. Tarzan has to be the player to step up. Like, I've said this multiple times in these videos, and longtime viewers of the channel know my thoughts and opinions on this situation, but Tarzan is AL. I don't want to, I don't really like saying this on broadcast or, when I talk about AL in more public settings, but at least here on the channel where you guys kind of know what I'm talking about, I can say it. Like, this is a 7th place team with a world-class jungler. Like, that is what AL is in terms of their roster construction. If Tarzan is going to play like a world-class jungler, then yes, AL can still elevate themselves up to being one of the better teams in the LPL, because there really isn't that big of a gap between being just okay and being one of the best teams in the LPL right now. But if Tarzan is not playing like that, which for large sections of this year he has not been playing like that, then we see what the problem is. AL is in the lower bracket for a reason, and that's because all of the pressure, the entire weight of this team is on Tarzan. He either is going to step up or step aside. At least in this series, he ended up stepping up and being the best player on the Rift. We'll see if that can continue, because it does not get easier from here. That I can definitely tell you, but there are some other positives. I think Hope was generally okay in this series. Maybe there were some team fights, some positioning mistakes that I think you can criticize. I really just don't think he was that good on the Varus in Game 3. The Corki in Game number 1 really never got any damage off in any of those fights that end up turning things in the back half. But overall, like, the bullet times were huge in Game 4. He got really accelerated on the Misfortune, and the Sivir was fine in Game number 2 as well. Hope's probably the player that, once again, is the second best player in their wins. That's been the most consistent role of anybody in the entire league throughout this year, is Hope being the second best player on AL when they win a series. Flandra was fine as well on the top side. Couple of mistakes in Game 1 on the Rumble that really cost them, but outside of that, perfectly fine series. Shanks, I think, he has moments. Like, there are really good moments. He got player of the game for Game 3. Part of that was deserved on the Akali. Part of it, I think, got a bit stolen from Kyle in the support position. But outside of that, like, outside of the Akali, like, yes, the Kassadin took over, but that game was already doomed at that point for NIP. It was the biggest stomp of the series. And the Rise, the Orianna, like, I'm just not sold on Shanks being a world-class mid laner. Maybe I'm just being too critical of the gameplay, but I think there are way too many holes in this guy's game right now, and he's just really inconsistent in these best of 5s. At least we're getting 50% of the games being good. That's not always the case for a lot of mid laners at this level. And then Kyle's KDA is much worse than his gameplay actually would indicate. He was excellent on the rel in Game 3. I think he was really good on the recon in Game number 4. A lot of really big moments, I would say, from him throughout this series. But this was Tarzan, 1v9ing, jungle canyoning, Nio on the other side of this, and really just being the best player on the Rift. And then for NIP on the other side, this is a really sad way, I think, for your year to end, because I think that there were multiple games that you probably could have closed out here. Game 2, Game 3, they were the better team throughout a majority of that game and just kind of made one error, one gigantic error, whether it was bot lane in Game 2 or the Otacon throw that everybody seems to be so susceptible to right now in Game number 3 that ends up just completely turning their entire split around. Who knows? If they win this series 3-1 and they move on to that next round, did they build enough confidence to really make a miracle run? You can never really know how things like that are going to go, but definitely some criticism to be thrown out here. Nio is the obvious choice for dead of the series. He was completely taken off of his game plan, I should say, and really, the main thing is just he did not feel comfortable at any point, especially after game number 1. I mean, he was down 30 CS in the early game, still was able to manage some really important smites in that first game, but after he got behind again in game number 2, it actually just looked like he tilted. Like, I'm not trying to make any assumptions, I'm not trying to overread into anything, but go watch his jungle pathing in game 3 and game 4 on Wukong and Olaf, especially the Olaf after he ends up getting taken out of his own jungle. He's smiting the wrong camps and not optimizing his clear. I'm not sure if that's because he's not comfortable on Olaf, a champion he has played, or if it's just because he is tilted and not locked in. He's also missing smites on every objective. There were genuinely 6 or 7 50-50s throughout this series between Tarzan and Nio, and outside of game number 1, I think Tarzan won every single one of them. It's not good for Nio. I'm sure his mental was kind of destroyed in this series. This was the first major challenge from a playoff run perspective for this young player that's had a lot of success at lower levels, and unfortunately for him, just wasn't quite up to the task here today. I think Doingby also really struggled in this series. He was kind of useless, quite frankly, throughout all of it. He was excellent in game number 1 on the Annie, really pushed that game forward and was the player of the game, as I stated on the broadcast, but everything else was kind of bad. The Victor game was terrible in game 2. The Karma was useless in game 4. The flash that he ends up having early on in that game to try and salvage a jungle play just completely, I mean, it's game over from that point. Not only for Doingby, for all of Ninjas in Pyjamas. He just wasn't good enough here today. I think Leave and Niket had their own set of problems. You know, we hyped up and kind of, talked about Niket needing to prove something in the pre-show. He did not prove it in this series. Kyle was certainly better. Solo kill was really good, and he actually looked very consistent in a lot of these fights. It just didn't end up mattering. Unfortunately for NIP, this is how their year ends, and in terms of how they performed, this is a pretty, I guess, accurate way maybe to describe how this team has looked so far this year, but I think in terms of their own internal expectations, they certainly expected themselves to be more competitive, especially after that winter split where, Doingby wins MVP and Leave is first team All-Pro and all of this stuff is going down. They've just not been able to recapture that same kind of form. I commend the organization for making roster changes and continuing to try and get themselves into a spot where they can compete, but unfortunately they will bow out in 7th, 8th place here, and in 7th place in particular here in the summer split. But AL moves on by the skin of their teeth, and they're going to move on to an even more difficult challenge with Invictus. We're going to preview that in just a second, but with the way that AL is playing right now, it is really easy to assume that this team is just not going to be able to make it out of round number 2, and that being the case for the defending champions is a very scary prospect. But if they can figure things out, we know they have the talent on this team. It all really comes down to whether or not Tarzan can be that 1A type of jungler, and at least in this series he was. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Summer Playoffs round number 2 overview and analysis video. Up on the screen, the updated bracket after 2 rounds of action. Our winners finals is locked in. Top Esports taking on Bilibili Gaming, and we have our first 2 eliminations. Unfortunately, Ninjas in Pyjamas and EDG Edward Gaming are done for the year, and that means we have actually locked our top 6 teams for regionals as well. 4 of those 6 teams will be going to Worlds. 2 of them will qualify through the playoffs here. Of course, the champion of the split gets the number 1 seed, and then whoever has the most championship points outside of that gets the number 2 seed, but then 3, 4, 5, and 6 go into that regional qualifier. It will be some combination of the teams left in the playoffs from here on out. So let's go ahead and preview who I think is in a good spot, who I think is in not so good of a spot, starting with upper bracket finals here. Top Esports taking on Bilibili Gaming. I think this is a very fun series, and I think right now, in terms of the teams that are white hot, it's clear that it's these 2 teams. IG even has things to figure out, but AL, Weibo, JDG, They're all kind of off kilter. These are the only two teams that I think have found any sort of success, and I think BLG is getting such a boost once again from reinserting Beichuan and just feeling so much more confident in the way that they want to play the game. But Top Esports has looked like the best team throughout all of the regular season. So who do I side with? Well, I'm going against the grain here, or at least what I assume is against the grain. I'm picking BLG 3-2. I think this will go the distance. I think it will go all 5 games, but I think BLG has figured something out, and I think these jungle changes continue to inspire the team, and I think they are picking something up here in Winners Finals, and I think they're going to punch their ticket to top 2 and basically get themselves to Worlds, depending on how things go. So really important series there, but I've got BLG. And then for lower bracket, the big one here, Invictus Gaming taking on Anyone's Legend. That's probably the one that is going to determine a lot of how the rest of these playoffs go. I still think IG's in a better spot. AL has just not proven to me that they are in a position where they can win a series like this yet. Do I think things could turn themselves around? Do I think this is prime for an IG upset to randomly get out of the playoffs? That does seem kind of like the narrative that would happen here, but I also think AL has kind of proven that they are not the team we think they are. I think Tarzan's going to struggle, and I think IG is going to pick up this series. I think it will go all 5, though. I'm predicting IG 3-2. And then finally, Weibo versus JD Gaming. Two very inconsistent, but overall quite fun teams to talk about here. I have Weibo Gaming going through. I think JDG is really struggling. I don't think they're a good team. I think they're the weakest of the teams left in the playoffs, and I think Weibo's going to take advantage of that, and I think they will win 3-1. Not quite a sweep. I think JDG is good enough to pick up a game, maybe off the back of Pays, but I think Weibo should be the better team here. So I've got BLG, IG, and Weibo Gaming moving on in the next series. Let me know if you agree or disagree with those takes down in the comment section below. Very curious to know what your thoughts and opinions are down there, but that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're gonna be covering every single one of these series on the channel. We'll be covering the semifinals in depth, the finals in depth, the regional qualifiers, and then of course Worlds once we eventually get there. We cover all 3 of the other major regions as well: LTA North, LEC, and LCK on this channel. LTA North is about to jump into the LTA just in general, so we're going to be getting Worlds qualification there, and LEC and the LCK are in the middle of their playoffs now. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. Of course, as a reminder, I'm still casting here for the LPL English. I will be on multiple of the broadcasts that will be going on over the next couple of weeks, commentating on some on the analyst desk for others. So go ahead and check out the links in the description to LPL English, the YouTube, the Twitch. They're going to be down there. If you ever want to see any VODs, or if you just want to check out some of my casting or thoughts live, say hi in chat. I'd love to see you around there. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all